It's my distinct pleasure to introduce UNH Anthropology Professor Dr. Amy Michael, along with her two collaborators, Lee Bingham Redgrave and Anthony Redgrave of Redgrave Research Forensic Services. Dr. Amy Michael is a professor in anthropology in the anthropology department. She came to UNH in 2018. Her research interests are in human identification and challenging cold cases, specializing in skeletal and dental microstructure research to estimate age at death. Her research also includes bioarchaeology and repatriation, and issues in skeletal collections held in museums and universities worldwide. And since 2019, Dr. Michael has been working with Lee Bingham Redgrave and Anthony Redgrave on the Trans Doe Task Force, a grassroots activist organization focused on identifying transgender and non-binary victims of crime. Lee Bingham Redgrave, who we're honored to have here today, is the co-founder of Trans Doe Task Force, along with Anthony Redgrave. Together, they also run Redgrave Research Forensic Services. Anthony has a MS in instructional design and technology and is working towards a doctorate in education and transformative leadership. His focus is on the development of forensic genealogy curriculum and best practices. Lee has experience dealing with difficult cases involving degraded DNA, minority populations, and international research. While they now run their own company, Lee and Anthony were once team leaders at the DNA Doe Project. So please join me in welcoming these scholars here today for their talk, Solved: Collaborative Research Methods in Forensic Anthropology and Cold Cases. Thanks for being here.
All right, thank you, Ellie. I have to give Emerson a shout out. She came up with this title, so I like it. So Anthony, can you advance our slides? I don't think I can do it, right?
Sure, I can, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Just tell me when.
Go ahead. We'll get into the first one here.
There you go.
All right, so I will provide a warning before we get into it here that I do have a couple images of human remains included in this presentation. Same as how I would present in class, I'm including these for learning purposes because of the case that we're going to talk about. So obviously no images should be circulated or shared. We're recording this, but again, it's in the spirit of teaching and learning. So just a heads up on that. And I do have a warning slide too for when I do share the skeletal photos. So we'll proceed with sensitivity there. So you can go to my next one, Anthony. So Ellie gave a great intro to us. I don't think there's anything more to be said for me here. I like how Anthony and Lee included our image here, our team photo. This is from a recent article that we had in Wired magazine. It was definitely my first time being photographed professionally. I think we look like a cool band or something, right? Lee and Anthony, do you want to say anything else about yourselves that Ellie didn't cover?
Yeah, sure. Just basically, that was an excellent introduction. Thank you very much. You know, our main places of interest are dealing with human identification issues for minority and marginalized populations, especially LGBTQ+ people and Black, Indigenous people of color, people who are from low-income families, people who may have had their cases deprioritized for being deemed sex workers, whether there was evidence or not. All these things are things that we care about a lot because everyone matters. So that's key to the case we're going to be talking about today. Everyone does matter. And in addition to seeking out my doctorate, I am also running a online training program for forensic genetic genealogy called FG4LE, Forensic Genealogy Training for Law Enforcement. It's not just for law enforcement now. People who are in forensics adjacent fields or who are already experienced genealogists can come and try their hand at doing what we do in a safe simulation where nobody's cases are going to be possibly at risk. So if you want to try it on and learn how it's done, you can come check us out. I think that's good.
All right, so I will start us off here. I'll be talking about obviously the anthropology side of the presentation, and Lee and Anthony can handle the genealogy side of things, then we'll come together and discuss a case towards the end. So we've estimated that we'll talk a little over an hour to leave plenty of time for questions if there are any. So quick intro, I know that I'm kind of scrolling through the folks that are here. I see a number of Anthro former and current students, so thank you all for coming. I also see my mom and my dad here, so thank you, Mom and Dad. And everyone else too. So a little of this might be some material that you already know if you are actually an anthropology student here or were. But quickly, what is forensic anthropology? That's how I describe myself, as a forensic anthropologist and a bioarchaeologist. So how does forensic anthropology relate to the topic at hand here, collaborating across disciplines? Forensic anthropology, your working definition can be something like the application of skeletal biology to medico-legal contexts. Medico-legal contexts are anything that's going to involve potentially law enforcement, a coroner, a medical examiner, a case that might go to court, right? There's all kinds of different levels there. But we use the same principles in forensic anthropology that we would use in bioarchaeology. It's more or less the same methods, give or take, but we're looking at different timescales, and we're looking at different sample sizes. In forensic anthropology, we're mostly dealing with individual cases, though not always, or you can have a mass event or something like that. But we're still going to take a holistic and biocultural approach. That's how all modern anthropology students get trained. That's definitely how we train our anthropology students here at UNH. And that means that we're looking at not just the individual in a forensic case, but we're looking at all the context surrounding that individual. So Lee and Anthony are like experts at this, right? And I've learned a lot from them about like contextual clues, looking beyond human remains, looking at, the archival records. So they'll talk a lot about that. But what my take home point for students in my classes too, is that forensic anthropology is so much more than just studying bones. If you find like bones very interesting, that's all well and good. You can be a biologist, and I wish you well. But to be a forensic anthropologist, emphasis on the anthropology, we have to care about the life experience of the person. That you can't. It's very reductionist to just say, oh, we just measure bones and we photograph bones and we try to make an ID. We do so much more than that. So you can advance me here, Anthony, if you would. How anthropologists specifically can contribute to identifications. We do it in a number of ways. This is sort of the most basic way in which we do it. We create something called a biological profile. The pieces of this can change depending on the case that you're working on, but more or less, here are the basics. We can estimate from skeletal remains, we can estimate sex, biological sex, we can estimate age, we can estimate ancestry. This might be what we kind of colloquially think of as race. And we can estimate stature, how tall a person was. We would also look at any trauma on the remains, and we'd also look at any taphonomic factors. Taphonomy is just kind of simply anything that happens to the body after death. So you can see how the totality of all of this gives us a lot of information about who an unknown person was. Our goal in forensic anthropology is, especially with creating the biological profile, is always going to be to narrow down our pool of potential matches, right? So we start with a complete unknown, and then we create our biological profile to try to figure out, who might this person have, what most approximates the reality of who this person was during life. Obviously, law enforcement is going to want that information if they don't know who the person was at all. And if we can say, this is a probable male, age 30 to 45 at the time of death, probable white ancestor, European or white ancestry, and about 5'6" to 5'10" or so, you can see how that very, very much helps them in a real way figure out who that individual was. All right, you can advance me here, Anthony. Some other things that we might be involved with beyond the biological profile are search and recovery missions. These are actually photos from my last job at Idaho State. So the top image are two of my students. You can see they're all booted up. They're searching a dry creek bed for human remains. This was a search and recovery case that we had. So anthropology students are trained to know not just what intact human bone looks like, but to be able to differentiate it between non-human bone and human bone, and also to know what it looks like when it's been exposed. In this case, to the environment, right? And looks weathered or maybe waterlogged or something like that. The bottom picture is something, oh, sorry. We should develop like a slide change signal.
I think I
The
clicked
bottom,
by accident.
the bottom picture is the guy on the left is not law enforcement, but he certainly kind of fits in with this photo, doesn't he? These are FBI agents who are part of the FBI evidence recovery team out of Salt Lake City. And here we were training them how to excavate clandestine burials. So this is like a mock burial training. So in these instances, we would use all the kind of anthropological training that we get in archaeology, one of our subfields, to use in a forensic search and recovery case. And those can look very different, right? Here we have 2 terrestrial cases, though we could have a case, with a water burial or something like that. Fire recoveries, that's a whole other field. So, but essentially this is all part of the job too of forensic anthropologists. All right, now you can advance me, thank you. Remember I said taphonomy is anything that happens to the body after death. So anthropology students might be exposed to all kinds of different sort of looks on skeletal remains. Certainly this is all stuff that I see in the lab a lot in forensic cases and in archaeology cases. So something like weathering and sun bleaching, where bone starts to have those longitudinal cracks and take on that really like bleached white appearance. We see that in cases where the individual has been exposed for quite some time on the surface. In buried bone, we see a lot of this root etching. It kind of looks like these carved out like channels in bone. And that's because the roots of plants in the surrounding area are more acidic than the bone. And so they kind of etch their way onto remains. The third image is something that somebody argued was prehistoric cancer. It's not. This is just termite damage, but it might mimic kind of trauma or pathology if you weren't sort of trained to see this. I actually see termite damage all the time in Belize, where I work at a particular field project. All right, you can advance me, Anthony. We might also be tasked with figuring out if something is taphonomic and therefore totally natural, or if it is traumatic. So something that fools people sometimes is animal gnawing. You can see sort of those little like scrapes, but if I was to zoom this image up, blow it up really big for you, you can actually see paired tooth marks. This is from an animal just simply gnawing away on a piece of bone. Very common culprits out here in New England are porcupines. Porcupines love to chew on bone, and coyotes as well. So the middle image, those are not like stab wounds or crushing wounds from a perpetrator or anything. Those are punctures from animal teeth. And they might mimic sharp force trauma, but we get our microscope out, we look very carefully, we consider the context of the area that we're working in, we consider the context of the recovery, and we can determine that that's not perpetrator-induced trauma at all. The third picture, however, this is actually a picture from the case that we're going to talk about at the end of towards the end of the presentation. And that is real sharp force trauma on human bone. That's a femur, or the bone that's in your thigh. And that is not going to that's going to be considered, of course, perpetrator induced and not natural, not taphonomic. All right, you can advance. So this is a little like simplistic. I would say a real day in the life of a forensic anthropologist, there should be a computer in this image, because that's a lot of like email answering and like firing off questions to Lee and Anthony and planning stuff. But for the most part, this is it too, right? We provide biological information about remains. So that's the bio profile I was talking about. We of course handle human skeletal remains. We're bound, like all research scientists should be, and especially those of us in the social sciences as well, we're bound by certain ethical standards in handling those human remains. And so all of that is imparted onto students too. The students that I see on this call, I know I can see Audrey's name in my little list here. they know backwards and forwards how to ethically handle human remains, why they're doing what they're doing, and they understand that's a privilege to do so. Writing reports, absolutely, that's part of it, and just kind of doing the general inspection of your cases. And I would add here, of course, teaching too, right? A lot of this, this is all, you know, service work, but it all also intersects with the teaching that we do. But I do want to draw your attention to what's missing here. Notice that, you know, it's not our responsibility to determine cause or manner of death. That is the responsibility of the medical examiner or the coroner, depending on the state that you're in. We don't weigh in on weapons used. We would describe something and say, okay, this is sharp force trauma, like the image that I showed you in the last slide. But we're not going to say, you know, what type of knife it was, or, you know, the pressure applied or anything like that. And almost always we don't engage in anything related to suspect interaction. There are a couple instances, at least in my career, that where I was around a suspect, and that was usually on a search and recovery, where the person was directing law enforcement where to dig because they had confessed to a crime. But for the most part, we don't have anything to do with suspects, and we wouldn't interact with them. So we provide all of this information to assist law enforcement, to assist medical examiners. Here in New Hampshire, we have a medical examiner system. And we also do research on methods to continually improve our analyses, and and how, you know, rigorous we can make those analyses to sort of get a better bioprofile going forward for cases. All right, I can advance.
Okay, now it's us. So what we do as forensic genetic genealogists is forensic genetic genealogy is using the principles of genetic genealogy to make an identification of an unknown decedent or perpetrator for law enforcement. So it's very similar to how someone might do a search if they were an adoptee and try to identify their parents, except we're trying to identify a person as an individual who hasn't been able to tell us for many different reasons, where they were born and when they were born or anything like that. So I'm going to explain this chart really quickly. This is basically what our workflow looks like. We have an unidentified decedent or a sample from crime scene evidence, and we'll get this processed by a lab process that we'll go over next, but this will be rendered into a similar file to that which you might get if you submitted your own DNA to Ancestry or Family Tree DNA or something like that. You'd get basically a giant spreadsheet of your DNA sequence. And eventually we get one of those. We upload it to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, and we get a list of all of the potential relatives of that person who have uploaded their own DNA. We don't know exactly how they're related. We just know how much genetic material that they share. And then we use their pedigrees combined to find common ancestors between them and try to do this logic puzzle to try to figure out where they are. So you'll see up here, there's a thing that says MRCA. That's a most recent common ancestor. That is someone who is most recently in the direct line of 2 or more DNA matches, not the DNA match on the person we're trying to ID because we don't know their tree. But we can infer using a method called triangulation that if there are 2 or more people who share a common ancestor and share DNA, and another person who we don't know where they came from but shares DNA with them, that they're probably related from that same common ancestor or somewhere nearby. So we find a whole bunch of these. You'll see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this example.
We do this over and over again.
This is
a truncated version
Yes.
of our tree building.
Usually there's about 400 of these. And in the process, we find places where these couples that the matches both relate to have descendants who have children of their own. This is called an XCA, or crossover common ancestor. Now we're going to actually visualize what this actually looks like in a later slide, but this is the sweet spot that we really want to find, because if we're finding places where people's genetic material is combining in a new way that isn't represented by any of the other DNA matches, we're probably going to find where the person we're looking for is. So we have to do this on both sides of the family tree, and then find where they all meet up at the parent level, and hopefully ID the person, or at least one of their siblings, and then figure it out from there. So if you were an adoptee, you'd be basically using the same process, except you'd be trying to identify your parents instead of you. going to advance this slide if I can move my things around here. There we go. Lots of things on my screen. Amy, do you want to fill in on this part?
Oh, I'm just talking and I'm muted. Sorry. This is not our case. We did not have anything to do with this, but to bring this home to New Hampshire a little bit, forensic genetic genealogy has been used with great success in New Hampshire. Some of you might have listened to the Bear Brook podcast put out by NHPR, Jason Moon's podcast, using forensic genetic genealogy. This was Barbara Ray Venter, right? Lee and Anthony? Or
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So a very famous forensic genetic genealogist worked on this case. And if anyone is familiar with this case, it is 100% worth your time to Google. It is a very deep dive. This podcast is fantastic. It's been covered on a lot of podcasts, but I just included this to say that the information that we're talking about today has a history in New Hampshire. It has a successful history in New Hampshire, and it's my kind of, oh, and also there's another not yet released case involving forensic genetic genealogy in New Hampshire as well. So watch the news. That will, I hope, come out sometime soon. I know I'm being vague. I can't say anything. But in our very small state here, this technology and this application of forensic methods is working really well. I made this slide, so I'll give my little spiel here. So as Ellie said in her intro, Lee and Anthony and I have been working together since 2019, though it feels a lot longer. It feels like we've been friends for a long time. And I think we are really successfully working towards case resolution, but I would also say, I should add on my own slide here, we're also, this is a nice union too for education and public awareness purposes as well. We've worked hard over the last 2 years, presenting at conferences, doing public outreach, talking to law enforcement, writing articles, trying to underscore that subdisciplines alone, just anthropology or just genealogy, are effective, but certainly more effective together. So we'll demonstrate to you how what that looks like in the rest of the presentation.
I just wanted to add here that I'm probably going to talk about it a little bit more later, but one of the main things that we as genealogists find incredibly useful about having an anthropologist around is that, again, in an adoptee case, that person is able to tell you how old they are and where they came from. We don't have that when we're working a forensic case, so we need the anthropologist to give us an estimate so that we can use that to base where we're looking.
So this is actually a slide right from one of my cold cases presentations. I teach a cold cases class on occasion at UNH. I've only taught it once, would love to do it again. I'm sure it will be upcoming students who want to take something like that. But here's a really famous one. If anyone recognizes it, this is Zodiac Killer. Still unsolved, obviously, we don't know who he was. But what is a cold case? We can kind of like quibble about what that means, but just so we're sort of on the same page, because this fits really nicely with the case that we've chosen to talk about today. Here's essentially what it could mean. Could mean that there's actually nobody even assigned to the case currently because it's so old. It could mean that there's no current activity. There's been no activity. It's for more than about 1 year. That's like an arbitrary number, but that there have been no tips that have come in during the past year. It could be long-term missing persons cases. Lee and Anthony and I deal with a lot of that, mostly Lee and Anthony, and their partner Jessica Velstra, who runs the LAMP database that I'm sure we'll talk about too. There could be a case with new leads, but there just simply aren't funds or resources to follow it up. I see this in rural jurisdictions, right, where there might be some new information, but the funding just isn't there to follow up on analyses. Could be undetermined suspicious deaths, all sorts of things. This is not an exhaustive list, but here's sort of like the medium in which we're working when we're thinking about cold cases. All right, you can advance me, Anthony. So when I teach the cold cases class, I tell my students, you got to start at the beginning. Sure, okay, you're going to investigate a case, or maybe, you're in a forensic lab and law enforcement calls you and says, what's the bioprofile on this person? And you want to start at the beginning. A lot of this anthropologists can't know because maybe even law enforcement doesn't know it. But to the best of our ability, we want to be clued in, unless we're doing a total blind analysis. We want to be clued in, at least in part, right? So here are some questions that law enforcement will ask. What happened? That seems like an obvious one, but of course that's going to be a difficult one to answer sometimes. Why was the victim killed, right? What was the motive? Who had the opportunity to do it? How did it happen? That's where sometimes anthropologists can come in. And where did it happen? Again, this might be where anthropologists come in because we read the external environment too. If we're talking about a clandestine burial or something like that, we have something to say through our archaeology training about maybe the burial scene as well. So we think about motive, opportunity, and means. Again, we're not law enforcement, and Lee and Anthony are not law enforcement. But certainly we're law enforcement adjacent, right? We're working towards that common goal. So while we can't know all of this, it's not, if you really care about, resolving your case, especially these difficult cold cases, it's worth thinking about. And certainly some law enforcement will share this information with you if you're not doing a blind analysis. All right, you can advance me. And Lee and Anthony, jump in on this one if you have anything to say, because I'm just going to make the point in the box here. But again, not an exhaustive list, but cases in our experience that are most likely to go cold: missing persons, long-term, I should say long-term missing persons. It's not illegal to go missing as an adult, right? But the longer you're missing, the more likely it is that your case will go cold. Gang-related cases, drug-related cases, houseless folks, transient folks, minorities, generally unidentified victims, right? The longer you go unidentified, the colder your case will get. People who die by suicide, and also accidents. So a point that I'd like to make, though, bringing this back to anthropology, is that I've noticed a phenomenon since I was in graduate school, and I didn't have a name for it, so I just made up a name for it, and I call them legacy cases. And in every place I've ever worked, and every school I've ever gone to, these exist in anthropology labs. These are parts of human bodies, so could be a skull, could be a random femur, could be a mummified hand. I mean, I've seen it all. That exist in anthropology labs, and they were accessioned or donated throughout the decades. And somebody retires, and so their collection, air quotes around collection, is taken up by the person who gets their job, and you just kind of get these long-term unidentified remains that we don't know if they're forensic, we don't know if they're historic, we don't know if they're native and need to be repatriated. And sometimes you don't have the labor power or the funding to even start to do the analyses on all of these, to tease out what exactly those cases are. So I've started to call those legacy cases, and I bet I could ask any professional anthropologist I know, and they will have some in their lab.
I'm going to just add in here as an example. So in regards to Amy's talk about legacy cases, on the flip side, as forensic genetic genealogists, we've actually had the experience of having to go contact local universities to find out if they have anything in their collection that matches a report that we have when we're looking for remains to get sent for testing. We've done that. And so it works both ways. So if you're ever in a lab and you have any legacy cases, as Amy says, try to figure out where they came from. So there we go. So in addition to the problem of why cases go cold, transgender victims or victims who may have been gender variant, or anyone who may have appeared to be in the LGBTQ spectrum to begin with, those cases very frequently go cold because of a number of factors. One of them that is definitely endemic to the transgender community is not being reported missing because you had to leave your home in order to get away from your family that didn't want you. So that's a major factor. If you don't have a missing persons report, it's much harder to pair that with a unidentified remains. So there's a lack of resources, there's a lack of evidence, and this all plays into what we talked about earlier about why cases go cold in regards to the minorities and such getting deprioritized. The missing, and less dead. This refers to people who are in those minority and marginalized groups who are not prioritized by the investigators because of possibly being involved in a high-risk lifestyle, which usually refers to sex work or drug or gang activity. People make assumptions because of observer bias, and this happens on a regular basis, or at least it used to, and we're trying to encourage people to stop doing that, and we're seeing some positive changes.
It still does in many places. It still happens in more places than it should, and we're trying to chip away at what seems kind of like a mountain of a problem, because it's a historic problem. It's gone back over the course of decades, that these cases have been just accumulating because of deprioritization.
And in addition to that, the misunderstanding of factors critical to ID. One example I can give about this is how can you tell if an unidentified decedent is trans? The fact is, you usually can't unless you have a really lot of contextual clues, and those aren't always present and are sometimes reported in very colorful language in older police reports. An example I can give is, what if you find a unidentified decedent within hours of death and they are assigned male but dressed as a female? How can you tell if that person was living socially as a female or in drag? How do you tell that? You might need to look at contextual clues for that. Like, is this person tucking? Is this person wearing really stage makeup? I mean, things like that. And those things aren't understood by the average investigator and require somebody from within the community to really be able to analyze those clues. Do you want to?
Sure. So this is basically why we started the Trans Doe Task Force. It was created so that we could research these specific cold cases, and also engage in education efforts so that we could help people to start to understand these topics if they're involved in these investigations. We do reach out to law enforcement and medical examiners and try to network to make sure that people know that we're here to help them decipher things about a case if they have one that they don't necessarily know how to proceed with the information that they have. We can help them to sort through that. And we came to this this concept when we were working with the DNA Doe project, and we had a couple of solves that we were involved in of unidentified decedents, and we went, wow, this is working. We were involved in the very first cases that they took on, and it was proof of concept at that point in time, early 2018, and bless you, sorry. And we said to each other, wow, this is working. This is going to have really far-reaching applications, and what can we do to look for cases that are from within our community that we really want to focus on and care about. So that's how we did, how that evolved.
So in addition to the Trans Doe Task Force, we have two additional projects that are
like sub-projects
that are interdisciplinary efforts to solve this issue of human identification for people in the LGBTQ community. So we have the LAMP database, which is LGBT plus accountability for missing and murdered persons, and the TDTF Pro Allies. I'm gonna read you a note from the LAMP admin, Jessica Velstra, who is in charge of making sure that people who need access to this can get it, and also taking cases for comparisons. LAMP is the LGBTQ+ Accountability for Missing and Murdered Persons database. The Trans Doe Task Force created this database to serve the community and attempt to match any unidentified persons with missing people whose cases require LGBTQ+ informed care and consideration. LAMP includes support for professional use by investigators such as anthropologists, medical examiners, detectives, and as well as use for by forensic genetic genealogists. LAMP is private and only searchable to those with an approved login to protect the details of missing LGBTQ+ people who may be endangered. Biological family and family of origin and chosen family and friends and members of the public can enter in missing person information without a police report needing to be filed. LAMP volunteers also actively search for cases of missing LGBTQ+ people. LAMP's missing persons cases are compared to the Trans Doe Task Force unidentified persons database regularly for potential matches. Just to sum that up, we have a method that we've developed based on other comparison databases that we've seen and tried to make there be more flexibility in how they can be used for comparisons. Because when you toggle that little checkbox of, is this person male or female, that sex estimation gets boiled down to a checkbox and 50% of the population gets ruled out. So what if somebody defaults to male because it's undetermined? Or what if there was older methods used to develop the biological profile that might be different now and they're not being compared to the right people? We consider all of that along with the issue of how do you code trans people when you're trying to get them identified or recover them if they're missing. And we basically just ignore the sex field. And we have added fields for contextual clues, as we talked about earlier, like time and place and any accessories or articles of clothing that might indicate belonging to any sort of minority group or any sort of community within the LGBTQ population, to make that a little easier. The TDTF Pro Allies page is a place for professionals working in related fields to support our work by listing yourself in a directory to stand up and say, hey, I'm willing to answer this question of what are we going to do about this sex estimation problem and how it's not serving the trans community. And people can network there, and we're working on a back end so that there can be a community discussion area that's private to professionals as well. But right now you can list your information so people can find you if they need help.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also you can use that to find other researchers who are working on things that you want to maybe collaborate with somebody on. So basically, we don't want to be the only ones doing this. We want to encourage other people to go and work on these problems as well. So this is people who want to support our mission, both directly and peripherally through their own work.
So we do have some very specific challenges with our work, as well as the ones we've already discussed. The big one is funding. Agencies don't often have a budget for forensic genetic genealogy, or if they want to fund cases, they have to go through some very rigorous approval processes. Specialized lab processes in genealogical research and even exhumations are really hard to get approved for funding. And so sometimes we might just go to fundraising just to circumvent that, because it's actually not easy to figure out right now. And the more evidence there is that the method works, the more likely that'll get budgeted for. So we're going to keep doing that. For example, we have a case that we have in fundraising right now that is Preble County Penny. She was found in 1968 in Preble County, Ohio. She's in the fundraising stage right now, and she's getting there, and she could really use some more support. So if anybody is here and wants to help out with that, we can get her through the lab process and get her identified. We're also looking into possible grant opportunities, but those are not as easy to find right at the moment. Many missing and unidentified case records and physical evidence pre-1990 have been lost or destroyed. The process of digitizing old records can definitely cause things to get lost or be scanned incorrectly. And then the physical records will get destroyed due to storage space. Fire and flood damage to agencies' offices can also make evidence just be gone. And older unidentified decedent remains are routinely cremated or put in mass burials, even today. It was worse before the advent of DNA, before people realized, oh, we need to keep these. They didn't keep them. they didn't think they'd need them for anything after they wrote everything down, not thinking ahead to DNA or advances in anthropological estimations. And improper and negligent storage of biological evidence. Again, before people knew how DNA worked, they might not have thought to refrigerate a blood sample or something. So, you know, we have these problems, and they come up pretty regularly, but we find ways to persevere. Observational bias, we talked about that in terms of the Trans Doe Task Force. So undomiciled, low income, LGBTQ, Black, Indigenous, people of color victims are often not reported missing or deprioritized. And if somebody has a high risk lifestyle, their case will possibly even just get completely dismissed and never looked at.
And we're putting that intentionally in quotes because it's just a very common thing that gets repeated. And it is, it's kind of a sweeping under the rug kind of method of.
It doesn't really get to the root of the problem. Like, why would someone engage in that kind of work if they didn't already have a high risk lifestyle in some areas of the world?
Well, but also
it's also very victim blaming. It's victim blaming rhetoric.
Yes. That's the crux of it right there.
And also sometimes it's just inaccurate.
Yes.
Sometimes people have other reasons for wearing whatever clothing they're wearing. So you know, it's usually an unhelpful blanket statement. If you see that in a report, it's a red flag for us.
Yes. Partial remains, uncertain postmortem intervals can affect estimating birth and death years. As we talked about earlier, we really rely heavily on anthropologists to give us those that PMI and that age estimation in order to narrow down birth year and date of death, or where there's no more proof of life activity. And if there's a really broad estimate because there's only partial remains, or there's not enough to give a really positive estimate,
or that confusing contributing factors, like the case we're going to talk about soon here.
So that can be difficult for us, but we still keep going. Usually the DNA will point us in the right direction. We'll talk about that too. Genealogical challenges. So forensic DNA kits are not as complete as DNA kits of living people. When you spit in a tube, you put it into a stabilizer, and then it stays the way that it was when you put it in that tube until it gets to the lab. It's very different from being left out in the elements for several months and getting weathered and rained on. And then having to extract from bones.
Yeah, or being handled by people who didn't know about contamination before, you know, advancements. So it's really something that makes a huge difference between working, for example, adoptee cases versus forensic cases. And a lot of people don't think about it. But once you think about it, you're like, oh, of course, that makes sense. We have parts of the kit will be missing. Usually there'll be chunks missing.
Yeah. So it behaves differently from working on DNA for living people, and you have to have specialized knowledge on how to handle that and make inferences and know what you're looking at and what might happen if an entire chunk is missing. Endogamous populations make predicting relationships difficult. Endogamy is the practice of intermarriage between small communities, such as isolated geographic locations or religious communities or ethnic groups. This is not uncommon. A lot of us here today have endogamy in our trees, and it's not a big deal, but sometimes if you get somebody who is from a small village in India, or from a native population, or from the Appalachian Mountains, you're going to end up having a harder puzzle to work because it will behave differently from the standard estimates that we can use to infer relationships. Limited representation of minorities in databases. So the CODIS database contains a disproportionate amount of minority groups in it because of the people who have been incarcerated in the state prison system and submitting their DNA to the system.
And that's a different kind of DNA than what we're looking at. That's measuring, that's comparing STRs, and we're working with autosomal DNA comparison. And the autosomal DNA databases are voluntary, you know, from direct to consumer tests. So people uploading themselves, it's primarily people of white European descent.
Yeah, primarily people of white European descent. And that brings with it its own problems of, you know, the data is not there for the people that we're trying to ID a lot of the time. And we have to figure it out. Yeah, so we're on to the next slide now, I think. So in spite of all these challenges, we've been involved in clearing a number of cold cases of unidentified decedents. of
somewhere around 25
We're
in the
around
past 3
25
years.
in the past 3 years, 25 in the past 3 years. All of these cases were cold for decades, and
many of them would have stayed, would have been shelved or would have not gotten solved if it wasn't for a team effort working on them. Having many people, working together like a think tank to solve a problem really speeds it up and makes it more possible.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about one of these today, and I think that I'm going to let Amy introduce our friend here.
All right, so this was actually the case that perplexed me greatly. And it is actually how I sort of really got to collaborating with Lee and Anthony. So this is a good one for us to cover. This is the case, I call it the strange and true case of Joseph Henry Loveless. Just a little bit about Loveless before we get into the kind of piece by piece parts of this case. He was a Wild West outlaw. That should give you a little bit of kind of temporal relevance here. He was a bootlegger. He was a jail escapee. What did he escape, like 3-4 times, I think we were able to find out. He was a murderer himself, but here's the important part. When I was working at Idaho State for a year before I came to UNH, all I knew about Joseph Henry Loveless, of course I didn't know who he was. He was represented by a set of skeletal remains without a head, and with obvious dismemberment marks. So all we knew about this set of remains was that he was a homicide victim himself. So when we set out to resolve this case, that's all we knew, right? So I like this case for a number of reasons. One, it's sort of this like interesting American history story. Two, it's really difficult forensic anthro case and super difficult genetic genealogy case, as Lee and Anthony will explain. It took a long time to solve, and we were so off on the postmortem interval, and that was after I think I lost count at how many people worked on this case over 40 years, but it was upwards of 60. So here's the story. All right, you can advance me, Anthony. These are actual case photos. So that I know that the one on the bottom looks like it might be bloody. It's not. This is just a maroon sweater. Although there might be some blood on it. I can't say for sure, I guess. But here's the general case background. In August 1979, we're in very rural Idaho, by the way, very rural. Like right now, there's 600 people in the entire county. So subtract something for 1979. The sheriff at the time responds to a call about a burlap sack with clothing found in a civil defense cave. Now, I don't think we have any photos. We should have included some photos from when Anthony and I went to the cave in December 2019. It was incredibly interesting. It's a lava tube cave system in Idaho. Idaho is like riddled with these, right? Because Idaho is full of volcanoes way back when. And the lava tube where this person was found is pretty small, but the one east of it is huge, and it was used as a civil defense cave, and it has lighting in it, and there are food rations in it. Even still, there are like old radios and stuff in it. It was wild to see. So at any rate, I'm telling you this because this cave system would have been kind of a known place on the landscape, both in modern, historic, and I'm sure prehistoric times, because there were native artifacts found throughout the caves as well. So in 79, these artifact hunters, all right, we're not condoning that, please don't go do that. They recovered, or they found a human torso in this burlap sack. Sheriff Holden at the time, this is recorded in the original case file, he said that based on the clothing that you see here, that he believed the remains were from like an old-time gambler. And he said the guy's probably 60 years old or something based on the clothing. So that, interestingly, that little detail gets recorded in the case file, but nobody takes it seriously. And that is because the body still has like an odorous presence, and the flesh is mummified. So the coroner at the time says, look, this person was clearly dismembered, but I don't think they died any more than 10 years ago or so because of the presence of the mummified flesh and the odor. So you have the coroner, who is, you know, the kind of the end authority on the body in this case, disagreeing with the kind of off the cuff remark made by the sheriff. There were no other remains or artifacts found during a search of the cave with a metal detector. However, they didn't search that well because, if you advance to me, Anthony, because in 1991, more limbs were recovered. So you have a 1979 torso, and then you have 1991, the arms and legs are recovered, again, by artifact hunters. So people just kind of like messing around in this cave. In 79, this torso was sent all the way to the Smithsonian, to Dr. Douglas Ubelacher, who's arguably one of the most famous forensic anthropologists of all time. And so we have his original notes and things in report too, and there really wasn't much that he could say about this person. Of course, flash forward to 1991, once the limbs were recovered, there is a full-scale search of the cave because the missing element here then is the head. The rest of the body was present. It was demonstrated that the torso and the limbs did all belong to the same person. So Idaho Museum of Natural History and Idaho State do a massive search. They don't find the head. This case is the defining definition of a cold case. In 1997, the remains were transferred permanently and they were stored in the lab that I then worked in 2017. So when I got to Idaho State in 2017 and I saw this individual laid out, my first question was, what's the story on this case? Is this historic? Is it forensic? What's up? And I was told that students were kind of using the remains of what was clearly a homicide victim for like teaching and learning purposes. And I thought, well, I would like to, why don't we try to figure out who this person actually was, right? I had been reading about some people doing really interesting kind of cold case approaches, but I didn't really know who to reach out to. Then in 2018, I started reading about what the DNA Doe Project was doing, and I was like, oh, okay, this might be the way to go. You know, I assumed the DNA Doe Project was like flooded with work, so I kind of tabled it, honestly, until I came to UNH, but I could not get this case out of my head. I think in part because it just seemed to me that it was solvable. We're talking about rural Idaho. Idaho only, there's actually fewer people in Idaho than in New Hampshire, believe it or not. Idaho is a massive state. But I just kept thinking like, this feels very solvable. You know, we have a lot of clues, we have clothing, we have all of this like systematic searching in this cave. I just couldn't stop thinking about it. There was another search in 2015. I was not part of this, but they didn't recover anything, no extra artifacts or anything like that. And definitely not the head. The head has, by the way, never been recovered. All right, Anthony, you can advance me. This is sort of what the scene looks like. That's probably the most cars that have been out there ever, like in all time. If you can kind of see on either side of that road there, that's where you drop into the cave. And those two different sides are kind of the various tube openings. So to the left is where the remains were found. To the right is the enormous civil defense cave. Just a close-up, law enforcement was nice enough in the 2015 excavations to go out ahead of time, and they totally like lit up the whole cave with these lights throughout. But you can see this is called a pinch out, so you can see you know, it's pretty close quarters. This is a very powdery soil, like you could excavate it with like a straw, just blowing it on it. And even when Anthony and I were there were bones throughout the cave. They were animal bones, but this is another good example of why you need a forensic anthropologist at your scene, telling you if the bones that you're seeing are human or not. Okay, you can advance me. The whole cave was LiDAR scanned. LiDAR is a really fun tool. This guy, Nicholas Holmer, he did it. He doesn't work at ISU anymore, but he did a great job. Basically, this gives you the capacity to pull up the LiDAR scans on a computer and kind of do like a 3D like fly through of the space that you're interested in. And they're like incredibly high res and really, really cool. So this can be taken to court or all kinds of things. But anyway, I'm including this to show you how much effort Idaho State threw at figuring out what was up with this case in particular. All right, you can advance me. More pictures. I think you can see from the left how powdery that soil is. You can see the students like trying to keep those walls nice and straight. Archaeologists on the call are probably shuddering at that. That's a really difficult sort of excavation there. A tusk found, or like I wish I was there to keep that. It's very cool. But definitely no more artifacts related to the case. So there were 3 massive searches, and in each instance, not much else recovered, at least related to the case. All right, you can advance me. This is a photo. It's not very good because I took it. It looks especially bad on my computer, but you sort of see like the caving out part in the foreground. That's where the torso was recovered. Of course, you know, lots of things have happened in this cave since 1991 when the torso, or since 79 rather, since the torso was recovered, but that's the general area. So you can see, well, you can't see, but I can tell you that it's not totally dark. It's what we would call in like cave speak a liminal space, which means there is some natural light. I thought that was interesting when I was there, thinking about the perpetrators and disposing of the body. It was clear they didn't want to go that far back into the cave. So that to me would make me think, okay, they don't have like torches or they don't have flashlights or something like that. Again, just sort of some speculative stuff, but definitely the remains were found not very far from the mouth of the cave. This is what it looked like when Anthony and I went. We were there on December 31st, 2019 to ring in the new year at a cave in remote Idaho. You can kind of get the remoteness sense here. It's very, very small town. In fact, when we pulled into town, and I use town extremely loosely, there's one gas station. We stopped to get drinks, and we heard everyone buzzing about the news. Are you going to go to the press conference? Like, are you going to do like? Are you going to go hear about the big announcement? It turned out that the municipal workers have been given the day off so that they could come to the press conference. It was actually very cool, especially as an anthropologist, to see everyone sort of rallying around this like mystery of their town, especially because this was such a known spot on the landscape. When you go through these gates that I don't think keep much of anything out, you can actually go down and walk around in these caves, and there's the graffiti, of course, to that end. And there's also historic graffiti. I saw some graffiti there from 1912. I thought that was pretty cool. And also very Idaho. You see that the sign is completely riddled with bullet holes. So, all right, you can advance me, Anthony. If anyone is interested in reading kind of a before the case was solved take on it, I would recommend Dr. Ubelacher's book, Bones. He talks about a lot of different cases in this book. If you're interested in forensic anthropology at all, it's a good book. But he mentions this case in particular, and he talks about how the postmortem interval is really difficult to generate. So he worked in '79 in coordination with the FBI. And they estimate that the postmortem interval, they pretty much agree with the coroner, and they say that this person has been dead for about 6 months to 10 years max. So remember, the original sheriff said, this guy's old, he's an old-time gambler, you know, probably didn't pay his debts and he got his head cut off or something. And he says the guy's been dead for something like 60 years. No one agrees with them, remember? And even the preeminent forensic anthropologist at the time and now says, nope, 10 years max. So flash forward again, there's not much activity aside from the limbs being found, but to 2017, my former chair when I worked at Idaho State, Dr. Kate Reedy, I asked her to submit a bone sample for DNA extraction to UNT. This then was entered into CODIS that Lee talked about. The NamUs account was updated. Again, I left in 2018 to come to UNH, but I became friends with Dr. Samantha Blatt, who is at Idaho State now. Lee and Anthony are good friends of hers as well. And we all sort of bonded over this case in particular, because I explained to Sam, hey, this one just like is sticking on my brain. And I think, you know, I've been reading about the DNA Doe project and I have a crazy idea, like, why don't we just write to them and submit something? We had a kind of a hard time convincing the detective, John Clements of Clark County. He's great, but, you know, he'd been kind of burned in the past by some forensic scientists, and he wasn't super excited to let us do this. And I was trying to explain genetic genealogy to him, but like I didn't understand it so much either at the time. So I think he thought I was like a little nuts. So I worked on this for a while to try to get him to give us permission to do this. He eventually did, and he and Anthony developed a really nice bond. I think they really got on like gangbusters. Oh, Emerson, I thought we had till 6:30 or just till 6. Oh, this is to me privately. Sorry, Emerson's telling me the hour is done.
Well,
all right, let me fly through this.
In an hour, but you know, it's fascinating. I want to hear you keep going. So
okay, sorry, I wrote down 4:30 to 6, and I'm sure that's what I told Lee and Anthony. All right, we'll go fast. So that's our general anthropology report. Again, not, you know, age estimate. How did we know about hair from the bones? Remember, there was mummified tissue on the body, so we were able to actually see hair still. Using all the kind of skeletal estimation methods, we estimated that this was a white individual, probable male, and about 5'5" to 6'1" in life. This was difficult because the bones were the limbs were dismembered, so we didn't have complete bones. All right, Anthony, advance me, please. Okay, so I have 2 slides coming up, again, showing skeletonized human remains. All the soft tissue has been removed. These are just skeletonized remains, but I totally recognize that that's still confronting for a lot of people. So this is my warning to look away, and I will tell you when to look back up if you would not like to see these. Okay, so here are the remains laid out, essentially as I saw them when I first came to Idaho State. And I said, who is this and what is the story here? So you can see, obviously, most elements are present, except for, notice there's, I don't think you can see what I'm circling, but there are no hands. Those are actually removed by the FBI to do fingerprints on, because you can still get fingerprints from mummified tissue. Those fingerprints did not yield any matches. There are a few other things to note here. First, there is kind of a square or a rectangular sample taken out of the right femur. That's a DNA sample, but the other cuts that you see are from the perpetrator. So, yep, thank you. So other cuts on the femur, those are both sharp force trauma and blunt force trauma. Same with the humerus or the humeri, if Anthony can circle those. Those are the arm bones. Yep. So those are perpetrator-induced trauma too. So we have, but overall you can see really good preservation, right? So this cave burial, you know, in a burlap sack in this kind of like particular volcanic cave soil, really well preserve these bones really well. So this is another thing, and all that sort of like brownish looking, especially on the feet and the tibia and stuff, that's all the fat leaching out still. So again, this doesn't look like an individual who's been deceased for that long. All right, so you can advance me here. Sock, that sock was actually on the mummified foot, so it was taken off. You can see, if Anthony can circle the vertebra there on the bottom, in case anyone doesn't remember their osteology here. And the picture of I should have cropped my hand out there, but you can see that it's very flat on the top. That is the actual dismemberment mark for the neck, right? So that's like a shaving off of that bone. It's actually pretty, we don't see like any bone spurs or anything. So whatever did that was pretty sharp. Contrast that with the image on the top. That's me trying to hold the femur back together. the cuts on the right, you've actually already seen these. I showed you those when I was talking about trauma. Those are hesitation marks. We know almost with certainty that that's where the perpetrator started. They started with a smaller bladed knife. And by the way, I should say that it is my opinion that this was a post-mortem dismemberment. We don't often see people who were dismembered while they were still alive, which is that's merciful, I suppose, if you can say anything. But these are very classic hesitation marks where it's like, okay, this isn't working, I need to move on to something else. And so you see there's radiating fractures throughout here. Probably there's pretty large bladed instrument that eventually was used in the post-mortem dismemberment. So like I said, we have sharp and blunt force trauma, clothing really well preserved. Again, we're back to this question of like, what is our post-mortem interval? How long has this person been deceased? Okay, you can advance me. This is just giving Idaho State a shout out. They have a really cool virtualization lab. They were able to put this all together. When they were able to stack all the remains together, so these are all the verts, you can see that there's some lipping on some of these verts. Anthony, if you can like circle around where the lumbar verts are. Yeah, perfect. Evidence of some arthritis and stuff like that. Maybe very slight spinal curvature. A little bit of sort of like pigeon toeing, but overall, not a lot of pathology or anything. It's mostly just the trauma that we see. Okay, can you advance me? Do you want to take over or?
Yeah, I'm ready to go with this one. So we first heard about this case from Amy on March 19th, 2019, when we went and presented a guest lecture about the Trans Doe Task Force in Dr. Michael's class for the first time. That was when we learned about him during the lecture that we sat in on. We learned that many people had tried to ID him and that there'd been multiple implements used and unclear PMIs, as Amy had just described. And so we immediately started coordinating the case submission to the DNA Doe Project in conjunction with Idaho State University and the Clark County Sheriff's Office.
At the time, we were team leaders, but we were also case managers with the DNA Doe Project. So we were able to basically fast track it because we were able to just coordinate really quickly with everybody who needed to talk to each other.
And so we were able to lead the genealogy team when the kit got through the lab process and had Amy and Dr. Blatt join us in our research as consulting anthropologists to help us narrow down the search with that insight that they have about the biological profile and what we can and can't know based on what's there.
We actually had them embedded with the working genealogy team so the genealogists could ask them questions as we were working.
So overall, this might seem like some big numbers, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So there were 14 volunteer genealogists working on the case together, including us. There were more than 2,000 cumulative research hours over the course of about 15 weeks involved in the actual genealogy research. We worked on the family trees of about 250 other people who had uploaded their DNA to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. And by the time we were done, we had 31,730 individual people inside of our research tree in the process of trying to ID this one person. That's how much work it takes. So let's talk about this timeline here. So the tibia was shipped for extraction for whole genome autosomal sequencing on 9th May 2019. They were able to obtain 6.26 nanograms. Now that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but actually it's pretty good because sometimes we get less than 1 nanogram and then we have to struggle. Sequencing was completed on July 5th of 2019. And bioinformatics happened after that. That's what happens when sequencing is completed. You get a giant hard drive full of information. A bioinformatician is a computer scientist who is able to take that giant hard drive of information and slim it down to just the parts that need to be compared to the other people in the database. So it goes from like several gigs to less than 100 megabytes. So we began,
and that's what gets uploaded to GEDmatch.
And that is what gets uploaded to GEDmatch, so it's compatible with the other kits. So the DNA Doe Project began forensic genealogy research with us team leading the case on the 18th of July. And from the 18th of July until 28th October, we worked pretty much nonstop without sleeping. And
No, we slept.
we slept some. And it was on 28th
They don't
October.
sleep.
Yeah, you're right. We don't sleep. And it was on 20th October 2019 that we were able to conclude with our research that we were able to present a candidate for identification, because we can't make a confirmatory ID. That's up to the law enforcement to take care of. And we concluded that we believed that Clark County John Doe was Joseph Henry Loveless, who we'll talk more about in a minute, and began confirmatory research to shore that up and be able to send a full report to the Clark County Sheriff's Office on 5th November. So it took us from 28th October to 5th November to compile all of our findings and send this in a way that was palatable to people who don't do the thing that we do. That's one of the hardest things we have to do ever. And it was on the 13th of December that his identity was confirmed with comparison to a living grandchild. In the context of the greater schemes of things, it took us about 7 months start to finish, 9 months if you start at the time where we first learned about the case. The entire length of the investigation itself, from the time the remains were originally uncovered until the time we completed it, was 40 years. The length of time that he'd been dead by the time we ID'd him was 103 years. And fascinating in regards to what Amy was talking about the original sheriff, the actual PMI on the remains when they were originally recovered was about 62 years.
Sheriff was right.
The sheriff was right all along.
The sheriff was right, and I know we've got a press conference slide coming up here, but let's shout out who also was right about this. The town historian who showed up. She was 90. She is 92 years old. And she came to the press conference, and she actually had written a book about the history of Clark County, Idaho. She had written 2 books about it, and in one of her books, she actually names Joseph Henry Loveless. There it is. She names Joseph Henry Loveless as a possible match for the body in the cave. So there you go. Listen to the historians, right?
Always listen to the historians.
Yeah.
So let's meet Joseph Henry Loveless. So Henry was born on 3rd of December in 1870 in Utah Territory, before it was a state. And these are his parents that we were able to narrow down by our research. His father was born in 1831 in Indiana, and his mother was born in 1839 in Salem, Massachusetts. They both migrated across the plains to Utah together as members of the early pioneers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that's how they ended up in Idaho together. This is an example of the result of all of our findings, slimmed down, not 270 matches, just a couple of them. This is called a dendrograph. This is a chart of how all of these DNA matches connect to each other and make the person that we're looking for, much like the example I gave earlier with the crossover ancestors combining. So you'll see that we had one Y DNA match, which helped us confirm the surname. And he was related to this match here, who was also related to a Loveless. So that's how we got that name. And on the opposite side, these other 2 matches shared no DNA with these 2, so we knew they were from opposite parents. And by finding their common ancestor, we were able to lead down to him. And then we confirmed with the grandchild, who we had to compare with the exact same methods, because with direct one-to-one comparison through STR, which is the gold standard of forensic DNA currently, you can only confirm somebody's identity if it's the same individual, their parent, child, or full sibling. So since he was not any of those, we had to do it our way and show that he was actually a grandchild.
If you're interested in more details on the genealogy aspect of this particular case, Anthony and Dr. Margaret Press of the DNA Doe Project co-presented on this case at this past issue, and there's a, I believe, archived video of that.
Yeah. So that is what it ends up boiling down to. There was a lot more than this that went on.
A whole lot.
A whole lot. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So it's not always as easy as you think it is. So here's an MRCA. So we've got a bunch of DNA matches who relate to this MRCA. A whole bunch of people lead up to him. Problem is, he has 4 wives. From each of those 4 wives, he has about 15 kids. And if each of those 15 kids has another 15 kids, you end up with, what do you end up with? One possible ancestor, 60 children, and around 900 grandchildren. This is not that different from what actually happened.
Yeah, this
because
is like maximum, potential descendancy here. But when you're talking about the early pioneers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah, some of the trees actually do end up looking like this.
We've encountered this actually more than once. So even if you feel like you're really hot on the trail and you're like, oh, we know who his grandparents are, because we've gotten there to that point before. We're like, okay, we can absolutely guarantee without a shadow of a doubt that this is the grandparent of the person we're trying to ID. Shouldn't be that hard unless there's 900 grandchildren. So then we get to a more complicated high-level genealogy task, which we use to narrow that down. This is called segmentology. So each of these little lines here is a DNA segment that a person shares with a DNA cousin. So for example, you'll see these are all color-coded. So these might represent 3 different individuals who relate to the person whose chart this is in 3 different ways. So this is what happens. So this might pertain to we might have one segment of DNA that we can triangulate to an exact ancestor. So this chunk has been passed down unchanged from a great-great-grandparent. There's another person who has a chunk passed down from another great-great-grandparent. There's another person who has a chunk passed down from another great-great-grandparent. But you'll see they're all right next door to each other. And if you have a case in which you have somebody who has multiple spouses and you need to narrow down which of those 2 spouses the person comes from.
And you have a bunch of DNA matches who have half relations.
What you need to do is you need to isolate, okay, so this segment comes from perhaps the husband. So maybe this segment here comes from one of those wives, and it will be right next door if you're able to have enough data to work with. You'll find somebody who has a segment who's right next door but doesn't overlap because they only relate to this family. And these are called crossover ancestors, as we saw in the chart earlier. These are places where the descendants of 2 couples have children that lead down to the person you're trying to ID. So let's go back to some of our research challenges. You've already seen a bunch of them, but let's break it down. So first off, Utah pioneer ancestry. He had endogamy because of being an insular community. And there were half relationships due to the practice of polygamy at the time. So there were hundreds of first cousins that can descend from a single grandparent. There's a broad postmortem interval and age estimate. As Amy went over, we saw why those were difficult. And that leads down to it being difficult for us because we don't know what birth date to look for somebody.
If you're a genealogist looking for somebody who's unknown and you don't know how old they were, you don't know what year they might have been born in, but you want to have a range of years that you're looking in for potential matches. So that's where we really turn back to the anthropologists and say, okay, now how firm are we on this PMI here? Can we look outside of the PMI? Is there enough reason to think that this might be fuzzy? We can, look for people who might be older than we originally thought they might be.
And we had some pretty good clues that our PMI was not great because a couple of things. One, the mummification, of course, is obscuring probably how old or the PMI. 2, he was wearing clothes. 3, he was wrapped in burlap. 4, we just have no data, like none, on how human remains decompose in that volcanic ash.
Well, now you do.
now we do. Now we know it acts as a preservative.
Yep. And also, I would assume that the limbs found in 1991 were probably in a similar state of preservation as the torso.
They were.
Found in 1979. Yep. So another thing that we ran into was the problem of Mr. Loveless having multiple aliases because he was a criminal.
He was a real-life outlaw.
He was a Prohibition-era bootlegger. And we needed to do additional research to prove that they were all the same person. We had a lack of official records because he didn't have a permanent address. He lived in a tent on the outskirts of town in 1916, which is when he probably died. So in the process, we came across some interesting archival documents. We do a lot of our research in newspapers.com and in archival books that are scanned by libraries. And in the process, we found some of these news articles that kind of pertained to people we were looking for. And we were finding people with the surname Loveless, and we were finding all this stuff about Cairns and Smith. but these stories, they seem to overlap with each other. For example, you can see wanted for murder, Walt Cairns, about 40 years. And here we have a gruesome murder with Mrs. Charles Smith being killed by an axe. The husband of the murdered woman has disappeared and he is suspected of the crime. Well, if Mr. Charles Smith did it and Walt Cairns is wanted for murder, what's going on here? There's my next clicky button. There we go. So we have, in the process of this, we know what was found on the body. We had this red sweater. So the wanted poster that we were just looking at says he wore a light colored hat, brown coat, red sweater over blue overalls over black trousers. And what was found on his body? Dark colored pants, a white shirt, maroon sweater. So he was found in the cave wearing the clothes that are described on this wanted poster of this Walt Cairns. So now we've connected two aliases. So then we have the name Loveless from the DNA. So here's the timeline of Henry. He was born in 1870. He had 2 marriages. He was married to a Harriet Jane Savage in 1899, and then in 1904 he was divorced.
I don't think we need to read through this whole timeline.
Okay, I'm just going to breeze through
because
it. So.
Everybody can access these slides, and I know that we're over time.
Yeah,
so if you want to go back and learn more about Henry's life, this is the slide for you.
Yeah, so we'll just skip to the end here. So Agnes Loveless is killed with an axe by Charles Smith, and the whereabouts of Joseph Henry Loveless are unaccounted for. And then a man named Walt Cairns is arrested, and here we go. So who killed Agnes? Walter Cairns formerly gave his name as Charles Smith, is being held at St. Anthony. He's saying that the woman's former husband killed her. Now, Agnes was actually previously married to a man named Smith.
Yeah, they had said Mrs. Charles Smith was killed with an axe.
Yeah, but the Charles Smith in question was living in a completely different state with a completely different family. So then we were able to eventually, from the sheriff's office, find an arrest warrant for a Walter Cairns, who was arrested on the 16th of May for murder. So this proves Joseph Henry Loveless, Charles Smith, and Walter Cairns are the same person. Agnes Loveless was murdered by her husband, who had these 3 aliases who all connect here. And this was later confirmed via the police records. Since we were unable to find his head, and still no one has been able to find his head.
And no photo of him was found.
Yeah.
Even though we have photos of his parents and his siblings.
Yeah. We always looked for that photo. We were looking for a photograph to just like put a face on this guy because that's just what we do. We always want to find that. And we weren't finding it. What I found was a whole bunch of photographs of family members and close relatives, parents, grandparents, and siblings. And we had the physical description from the wanted poster. So I made a composite image based on that information. This will be in the PDF. You can go to this link and watch a video of how I created it. This is the infamous Freddy Krueger that went all through the news, but that's what he probably looked like.
He's allowed to wear a sweater.
He's allowed to wear a turtleneck sweater and a hat. It's true.
And the wanted poster did say little to no eyebrows, so.
Yes.
It did say that.
Yes. Also, his dad had little to no eyebrows, so it made sense. So positive identification. So we actually used a direct-to-consumer DNA test that was hand-delivered by Idaho law enforcement to this 87-year-old grandson. He actually drove across the country to drop it off. And when those results came back, when they were processed by the commercial lab, we downloaded that DNA and we uploaded it to GEDmatch and did a 1-to-1 DNA comparison. That proved that they were 100% likely to be grandson and grandfather. So we shared that results and completed findings with law enforcement.
We compiled the official DNA Doe Project report and put that comparison into that report.
Yep.
And then sent it back to law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. And not long after that, on December 31st, 2019, we had our press conference. There's a recording of the full press conference. You actually get to it on our website at redgraveresearch.com. You can go watch it on Henry's page there.
If you click on cases, you'll find his case page.
Yeah. At the end of it, Deputy Clements, who's now Sheriff Clements, by the way, congratulations.
Yes.
Was in the beginning, he was dubious of doing this. And then at the end, you see that grin. Ooh, look at that. He's not displeased anymore. He was so ecstatic. Like, it was mind-blowing for everybody. We really had a great time.
Even if we identify somebody whose family is no longer living and there's nobody who's really grieving or mourning them, it's always a pleasure to see how the closure of a case affects the law enforcement who have been working so hard.
Yeah.
It's really nice.
Mm-hmm.
And
Like sometimes
case,
there's that one case that just makes it so that people can't retire, and we like to help them with that too.
And in this case, this was the community was quite involved. This was a story that people had grown up hearing. They had stories about, they had visited the cave. And I would say, I don't know, Anthony, 100-ish people came to this press conference, which was like a sixth of the town.
Yeah, it was
So,
most.
it was pretty interesting. And like I said, the 92-year-old historian, I mean, it was very cool to see it all come together. I like this picture too, because none of us are looking in the same direction. So
No, that's because there were like 10 people taking photographs, and
we
none of
didn't
us
plan.
were looking at the same camera.
We're not pros at the photography, I guess.
So story went viral. Associated Press picked it up. I did interviews with CNN, NBC, BBC, and even the Slovak radio called me to record an interview with them. That's new and never happened before. And so it really like picked up.
It was the top headline January 1st, 2020.
Yeah, we really set the bar there, I think. I think coronavirus was jealous. So what ended up happening was I didn't sleep for several days because of all the interviews, and eventually I did get to sleep a little. But you'll see these are just some clips of like some of the places where it ran. We had New York Times, we had Washington Post, New York. So a lot of this is the repost of the AP, but there's a lot of individual articles as well. And these are all also aggregated on our website if you want to go back and look at them.
I think it really excited people because we've been seeing a lot of cold cases getting solved, and a lot of does getting their names back over the past couple of years. This at the time was the oldest solved case by this method. I think people got really excited that it could be this far reaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm going to pass it back over to Amy for you.
Okay, so I know we are way over, but just bringing it back home to UNH Anthropology for the 603 challenge part of the week. And thank you, Lee and Anthony, for participating with us too. We have 7 cases in our lab right now. It's a mix of repatriation cases, a homicide or 2 homicide cases, historical cases, and complete unknowns, right? We're just kind of at a loss. So our students are trained to photograph cases, collect data, fill out case forms, all kinds of stuff. So here are UNH students. Actually, this is part of a filming segment for a public access show out of Mass called Kelly's Quest, which is really great. Lee and Anthony and I were on an episode of Kelly's Quest. I totally recommend giving that a Google. I don't know if we can quickly access that link for people or not. Redgrave, if you have it handy.
The link to is actually on the Trans Doe Task Force website. So if you go to transdoetaskforce.com, you can pull it, .org, you can pull it up there.
Excellent. All right, I think I have one more slide. Just more UNH Anthro students serving their communities. So public outreach, when hopefully we'll have Pride again in 2021 in person. Oh my God, right? But this was 2019 Pride. A couple Anthro alums went with me, an anthropology student on the bottom there, Logan Schnell, current Anthro student, alum Audrey Waterman, and current student Victoria Slight measuring an individual for a research project that they had. So this is all experiential learning and research. It's all hands-on. It's my belief you can't really learn how to do forensic anthropology without actually doing the work alongside me. By the way, all these students know Lee and Anthony too, so the Redgrave have shared their knowledge greatly at UNH beyond even guest lectures and things like this. So, all right, I think that's it for me.
Yep, so I think we're open to questions for a minute, and
I don't know if we have time, but
yeah, these are our links. You can ask us questions there, and this is our contact information. If you have any questions about Redgrave Research or Trans Doe Task Force, you can email me and Lee. If you have any questions about the LAMP database and you want to contribute any missing persons information or talk to somebody who knows how to make those comparisons, you can email Jessica Velstra at lamp.tdtf@gmail.com. And she will give you her all if you have any questions. So again, hopefully we'll have Pride again soon, but does anyone have any really quick questions before we go? Like,
Yeah, thank you. Please, I invited people to put them in the chat. We have one question actually asking when when the recording is going to be available. I have a few. I know we're short on time, but I do want to, if there's especially students out there, I know there's a lot of you too. Feel free to ask questions. I will say that all that media, I was curious to know how that impacted, particularly the forensics, your business, and how, was there a lot of fallout from that? All the media, I read the full-length Wired magazine article, which is fascinating. So if you have not gotten a chance to look at it, check it out. What was that like with all that massive amount of media?
there were long-term and short-term effects.
Yeah. I think we're getting
The
used
first time that I understood why people tell you not to read the comments on stuff, because I
Yeah.
was like,
never read
God, the internet is so mean. I think overall, I like how I just inserted myself in this. This is a Redgrave's question, but
It's
No,
okay.
it's all of us.
Yeah.
I think overall, like, I something that I really learned about through this case in particular was like I doubled down on my like belief, like I will die on this hill, that we cannot mete out justice unequally. So we got a little bit of flack online, not a lot, but a little bit, for people being like, why'd you waste all your time identifying a murderer? And it's like, well, we didn't know he was a murderer when we started it. And also, like, he was murdered himself. So the idea that we can only identify people who are like worth it, I don't, that's not what I believe. That's not what I teach my students. That's not what the Redgraves and I work towards. So I think that this case really nicely highlights that yeah, this guy was not a great guy. And in fact, when his 87-year-old grandson found out that we had identified him, he was completely uninterested. But that's a lesson too,
That
right?
was another question I had. Yeah.
So you know, I think sometimes
cooperate.
right, like I think sometimes we think like, oh, this is such noble work, and you know, like the good, you know, murder people are going to be identified, and it's like, okay, yes, but also, you know, humans are much more complex than like all good or all bad, and I think that people aren't always the worst thing that they've done, and they're not always the worst thing that's ever happened to them. So I think that like this case taught me a lot of like real humanizing lessons in forensic anthropology. So that's how I would answer that. Like the sort of long-term effects of like the media spotlight on this case, for sure.
Every single person that we have ID'd has been flawed in some way, but none of them deserve to die. As far as like the effect on our work, like we're still getting questions about this, even though we're no longer working with the DNA Doe project and we have our own company. We're still getting questions about this because we were in the thick of it. We did a bulk of the work and the communication, and we learned a lot, and we're able to translate that into successes for other cases. Like one thing that we learned from working on this case was actually, if you have remains that are that old, you can look like you have a whole bunch of DNA matches that are really endogamous and interconnected, but that's because modern generations have intermarried those lines on both sides in different ways, and it sort of kind of turns inside out. And we'd never seen that before. We also learned that the conditional probability tool that we use to guide our research and figure out where to look actually does work for cases this old, even though we thought we broke it when it kept telling us he was old.
Yeah.
That's so
I think
fascinating.
we also really learned that you know, it really helped us to really truly understand what an estimate means. If you have a PMI estimate or you have a sex estimate, a lot of times we don't retain the estimate part. We just focus on it as a fact. But as researchers, if we're dealing with estimates that have been given to us, we have to remember that they're estimates.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if they're very old estimates, that methods may have improved over time. So we have to keep an open mind and not narrow. Of course, the goal is to narrow down, like Amy said in the beginning of the presentation, anthropology is you know, the goal is to narrow down the field of potential matches, the pool of potentials. We don't want to get tunnel vision based on an estimate.
Yeah, one of the important things that we do through the Trans Doe Task Force is actually ask people to be less specific, because you can't infer somebody's gender identity from their physical remains. And that is very hard to ask people involved in science and in law enforcement to do, but that is what we need in order to solve this problem that is a real gap in service.
We want to narrow the field of potentials by being more accurate, not necessarily more specific at the expense of accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Our estimates should always approximate reality the best that we can, rather than just cross people off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and it's amazing how much data, I mean, and it truly was so interdisciplinary. I think that's the most impressive, the magnitude of the genealogical DNA data that you all combed through, and then not the archaeological recovery, right, of the remains, the osteological study. I mean, on and on, just amazing. And then and the archival research. I mean, you literally keyed into every part of the anthropological process, I think every subdiscipline there. And so it's so impressive, really.
They even get like linguistic anthro up in there sometimes too, Ellie. Like,
right?
I see in the chat sometimes in the Discord that the Redgraves have, like, they're talking about language and stuff too. So it is very, I think, and this is why part of why anthropology students, when I talk to them about this type of work, they're really drawn to it, because it nicely sort of corresponds.
We can add a lot of historical context to the time and place that remains were found or when a person was living, and that really does play in when you're talking about older cases. We talk about this in other presentations, how you can't let your current social understanding color your interpretation of how things were at that moment in time. And we do a lot of that. We do a lot of time and place study even before we ever get the DNA.
Wow. Well, thank you all so much.